The smoke from burned homesteads had a color in the Missouri border of 1864 that wasn't quite gray and wasn't quite black. It was the color of everything a family ever owned, turned to ash and carried away on the autumn wind. That smoke hung over 4 entire counties like a funeral shroud, and underneath it, the chimneys stood alone like grave markers for houses that used to hold laughter and Sunday suppers and the small dignities of frontier life. The smell of it, charred wood and ruined dreams and something else, something worse that folks didn't like to name, that smell soaked into the land so deep you could taste it in the water from the wells. General Order Number 11, they called it. Fancy name for burning folks out of their homes and driving them like cattle across the Kansas line. Brigadier General Thomas Ewing, Jr., sitting comfortable in his Kansas City headquarters, had signed his name to that order and felt damn proud of himself for it. Military necessity, he called it. Deny the bushwhackers their support, starve them out by emptying the countryside. Near about 10,000 souls, men, women, elderly, families who'd worked that Missouri soil for generations, forced to leave with whatever they could carry. And if you didn't leave fast enough, if you protested, if you clung to the land your grandfather had cleared with his own 2 hands, well, General Ewing had a solution for that too. The Harrison farm sat in Jackson County, right on the edge of what used to be good farming country before the war, turned neighbor against neighbor, and Kansas jayhawkers started using rebellion as an excuse for murder and theft. Old Thomas Harrison was 72 years old, his wife Margaret near about 70. They'd raised 6 children on that land, buried 2 of them in the family plot under the big oak tree. Their daughter Elizabeth had come back to the farm after her husband died at Wilson's Creek, bringing her 2 grown sons with her. The Harrisons weren't soldiers, weren't guerrillas, weren't nothing but farmers trying to survive a war that kept finding new ways to devour innocent folks. When the deportation order came, old Thomas looked at that piece of paper and then looked at his land, and he made his choice. "I was born on this soil," he told the Union lieutenant who brought the order. "I'll die on this soil if need be, but I ain't leaving." Elizabeth begged him to reconsider, but the old man was stubborn as Missouri bedrock. Margaret stood beside her husband like she'd stood beside him for 50 years, and that was that. General Ewing heard about the Harrisons' defiance, and he decided to make an example that would echo across every county in Missouri. "All right, folks, if you want to know how this whole mess ended, hit that like button and subscribe right now, because what's coming is damn brutal, friend." October 12, 1864, General Thomas Ewing, Jr. rode out to the Harrison farm personally, bringing a company of federal soldiers with him, not to arrest the Harrisons, mind you. Not to forcibly relocate them. Ewing had something else in mind, something that would show every stubborn Confederate sympathizer in Missouri what happened when you defied federal authority. The soldiers surrounded the house at dawn. Thomas Harrison came out on his porch, squinting into the morning sun, trying to understand what he was seeing. Margaret stood behind him, her hand on his shoulder. Elizabeth and her sons were still inside, starting the breakfast fire. "Mr. Harrison," Ewing called out from his horse, his voice carrying that particular tone officers use when they want to sound reasonable while doing something monstrous. "You were given 2 weeks to evacuate under General Order Number 11. That time has expired. You are now in violation of federal military law." "This is my land," Thomas said, his voice steady despite the rifles pointed at his chest. "You got no right." "I have every right," Ewing said, and he nodded to his men. They didn't arrest the Harrisons. They forced them back inside the house, Thomas, Margaret, Elizabeth, and her 2 grown sons. The old man fought, weak as he was, until a rifle butt to his stomach doubled him over. Margaret screamed until they shoved her through the door. Elizabeth tried to run, but soldiers caught her and dragged her back. The sons, strong young men who could have fought, didn't resist because they couldn't believe that Federal soldiers would do what Ewing had ordered. The soldiers nailed boards across the doors, across every door, front, back, the root cellar entrance. They nailed boards across the windows too, thick planks hammered in tight, while the Harrisons beat against them from inside, their voices rising in panic as they understood what was about to happen. General Ewing sat on his horse and watched his men work. When the house was sealed tight as a coffin, he gave the final order. Burn it! The smell of kerosene splashing against dry wood, the scratch and flare of matches, the whoosh of flames catching hold, climbing up the walls like eager devils. Inside the house the screaming started, not words anymore, just raw terror and agony as the fire found them. Thomas Harrison's voice, cracked and ancient, begging for mercy that wouldn't come. Margaret's screams cutting off sudden and awful. Elizabeth pounding on the boarded windows, her hands breaking against wood that wouldn't give. The sons throwing their bodies against the nailed door, the sound of their impact getting weaker as smoke filled their lungs. The soldiers stood in formation and watched. Some looked away, some looked sick. But they were soldiers, and Ewing was a general, and orders were orders. The fire burned hot and fast, feeding on everything the Harrisons had built over a lifetime. The roof collapsed inward with a sound like thunder. The screaming stopped, but the fire kept burning, and General Ewing kept watching, his face showing nothing at all. When it was done, when the house was just blackened timbers and ash and things no decent person would want to examine too close, Ewing addressed his men. "Let word spread of what happened here," he said, his voice calm as a Sunday sermon. "Let every rebel sympathizer in Missouri know that defiance will not be tolerated. This is war, gentlemen, and in war, hard measures are necessary." He rode away then, back to Kansas City, back to his comfortable headquarters, back to his maps and his reports, and his satisfaction at a job well done. The soldiers followed, leaving the Harrison farm smoking in the autumn morning. By noon, the news had spread to every corner of Jackson County. By sunset, it had reached the guerrilla camps hidden in the Missouri brush. By midnight, it had reached Bill Anderson. Word count, 1,247 words. I need to continue to reach the 1,600 word target. Continuing. Bill Anderson sat in his camp in the thick woods along the Little Blue River, cleaning his revolvers by firelight, when Jim Cummins rode in with the news. Cummins was one of Bill's scouts, a quiet man who'd lost his own farm to Kansas Jayhawkers 2 years back. He dismounted slow, his face tight with the kind of anger that goes beyond words. "Bill," he said, "you need to hear this." The camp fell silent. 20 guerrillas, hard men who'd seen every kind of brutality the border war could devise, stopped what they were doing and listened as Cummins described what General Ewing had done to the Harrison family. He spoke in a flat, dead voice, reciting facts like a man reading from a ledger, but his hands shook as he talked about the screaming, about the house burning with people nailed inside it, about Ewing sitting his horse and watching like he was observing a training exercise. Bill Anderson didn't move, didn't blink, just kept cleaning his revolver, the cloth moving in slow circles over the metal. The firelight caught his face, throwing shadows across features that had gone hard as granite. The other guerrillas knew that look. They'd seen it before, right after the Kansas City prison collapsed and killed Bill's sisters. They'd seen what came after that look. "Where's Ewing now?" Bill asked, his voice quiet. "Back in Kansas City," Cummins said, "but I heard talk he's planning some kind of inspection tour through the depopulated counties. Wants to see his handiwork, I reckon. Survey what he's done." Bill set down his revolver, set down the cleaning cloth, looked up at Cummins with eyes that held nothing human anymore, nothing soft, nothing that resembled mercy or hesitation or doubt. "When?" Bill asked. "Week from now, maybe 10 days. He'll be traveling the burned counties, giving speeches about how successful the deportation has been." Archie Clement, sitting across the fire, let out a low whistle. Little Archie, they called him, on account of his size, but there wasn't nothing little about his capacity for violence. "A general," Archie said. "You thinking what I'm thinking, Bill?" Bill Anderson stood up. Around the camp, guerrillas rose with him, understanding without words what was coming. Jesse James, barely 18 years old, his face still holding some of the softness of youth, looked uncertain. Frank James, older and harder, showed no emotion at all. Cole Younger cracked his knuckles, a nervous habit he had before action. Dave Poole checked his weapons with calm efficiency. "I'm thinking," Bill said, his voice carrying across the camp, "that General Thomas Ewing Jr. is about to learn something they don't teach at West Point." He paused, looking at each man around the fire. "I'm thinking he's about to learn what happens when you burn families alive in Missouri. I'm thinking he's about to learn that rank and federal authority don't mean a goddamn thing when you're face to face with the sons and brothers of the people you murdered." Jim Anderson, Bill's younger brother, stood beside him. "We going after a general, Bill? That's different than bushwhacking supply wagons." "Different how?" Bill asked. "He bleeds like any other man. He'll beg like any other man. And he'll die like any other man." Bill's hand rested on his revolver. "Only difference is he's got more blood debt to pay." The guerrillas looked at each other. This was beyond their usual operations, beyond anything they'd attempted. A Union general with a full company escort, maybe more. The retaliation would be fierce. Federal forces would hunt them without mercy. But then, Federal forces were already hunting them without mercy. And the Harrisons were already dead, burned alive in their own home. And Bill Anderson's sisters were already dead, crushed in a Kansas City prison collapse that Ewing had called an unfortunate accident. "I'm in," Archie Clement said. "Me too," said Frank James. One by one, every guerrilla in that camp volunteered. Because that was the thing about Bill Anderson. He didn't just lead men. He led men who'd already lost everything, men who had nothing left but rage and loyalty and a burning need to make the Union pay for every murdered family, every burned farm, every widow and orphan the border war had created. Bill Anderson looked at his band, these hard-eyed killers who'd followed him through 2 years of the bloodiest guerrilla warfare the continent had ever seen, and he smiled. It wasn't a pleasant smile. It was the smile of a man who'd found purpose in vengeance, who'd discovered that making evil men suffer was the only thing that quieted the screaming in his head. "Then let's go hunting," Bill said. "Let's go hunting for a general." The days that followed brought more news, and each piece of information made Bill Anderson's blood run colder and his purpose burn hotter. His network of informants, Confederate widows, displaced farmers, sympathizers who'd managed to avoid deportation by claiming Union loyalty, fed him intelligence about General Ewing's movements, and worse, about what the general had been doing in the depopulated counties. Sarah Mitchell rode into Bill's camp 3 days after Jim Cummins brought word of the Harrison burning. Sarah was a widow, her husband killed at Pea Ridge, her farm confiscated under Order No. 11. She'd been living in a brush arbor shelter in the woods, surviving on whatever she could forage and whatever the guerrillas could spare her. She was 32 years old, but looked 50, her face lined with hardship and hunger. When she dismounted, Bill saw her hands shaking. "Bill," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I got to tell you something about Ewing." They sat by the fire, and Sarah told her story in fragments, stopping often to collect herself, to push past the shame and anger that kept choking off her words. 2 days prior, General Ewing had visited the ruins of Lone Jack, another Jackson County town that Order No. 11 had emptied. A handful of people remained, mostly elderly folks too stubborn or too weak to leave, scraping out existence in the ruins. Among them was Rebecca Turner, a widow in her 40s, whose husband had died of fever the previous winter, whose sons had gone to fight for the Confederacy and never come back. Rebecca had stayed in her small cabin on the edge of town, keeping to herself, bothering nobody. Ewing's patrol found her there. The general was in a mood to make examples, to demonstrate federal power over every corner of Missouri that dared harbor Confederate sympathy. He'd ordered Rebecca brought before him in the town square, or what remained of it, just burned foundations and scattered rubble. "You were ordered to evacuate," Ewing told her, his voice carrying that same reasonable tone he'd used with Thomas Harrison. "Yet here you remain, in defiance of federal military authority." Rebecca Turner was a small woman, worn down by loss and loneliness, but she had pride. "My husband's buried here," she said, standing straight despite the rifles pointed at her. "I ain't leaving him alone." What happened next made Sarah Mitchell's voice break as she described it to Bill. Ewing had ordered his soldiers to strip Rebecca Turner of her dress, to leave her standing in her undergarments in the October cold, while the soldiers laughed. Then he'd ordered her tied to a wagon wheel in the center of the square. "You want to stay in Missouri?" Ewing had said. "Then you'll learn what happens to those who defy federal orders." They'd whipped her, 10 lashes across her back with a leather strap, each one drawing blood, each one accompanied by Ewing's calm voice counting. Rebecca Turner didn't scream. She was Missouri stock, too stubborn to give them that satisfaction. But Sarah, watching from hiding, saw her body jerk with each impact, saw the blood run down her back and soak into her undergarments. When it was done, Ewing left her tied to that wheel for 3 hours while his men made camp nearby. Left her there in the cold autumn air, bleeding and shaking, as an example to anyone who might think about defying federal authority. When they finally cut her down, she collapsed into the dirt and the soldiers rode away laughing. Sarah Mitchell had found Rebecca after the Federals left, had tried to tend her wounds with rags and creek water. "She's still alive," Sarah told Bill, tears running down her weathered face. "But she ain't right. She just stares at nothing and don't talk. She's broke inside, Bill. That bastard broke her." Bill Anderson listened without interrupting. When Sarah finished, he stood and walked to the edge of camp, staring out into the dark Missouri woods. Behind him, he heard Archie Clement cursing in a low, vicious monotone, heard Jesse James asking in a shocked voice how Union soldiers could do such things to a defenseless woman, heard Frank James, always practical, asking Sarah for more details about Ewing's route and schedule. Cole Younger came to stand beside Bill. "You all right?" "No," Bill said. "I ain't been all right since they killed my sisters, since they started burning families and whipping widows and calling it military necessity." He turned to look at Cole, and his eyes held that flat, dead look that meant someone was about to die hard. "But I'm about to be a whole lot better." The intelligence kept coming. Two days later, a Confederate sympathizer named Robert Hayes brought word that Ewing had stopped at the former town of Chapel Hill, where he'd found an elderly couple, Martin and Ellen Sykes, both in their 60s, living in a lean-to shelter built from salvaged timber. The Sykeses had lost their farm, lost their 3 sons to the war, 2 to Union bullets, 1 to fever in a Confederate camp, and had nowhere else to go. Ewing had their shelter burned. Just set fire to it while they watched, destroying what little they had left. Then he'd addressed them with that same calm, reasonable voice he seemed to favor. "This is what rebellion costs," he'd told them. "This is what supporting bushwhackers and guerrillas brings you. You people of Missouri made your choice. Now live with the consequences." Martin Sykes, 68 years old and broken by grief and loss, had dropped to his knees and begged for mercy, for shelter, for anything. Ewing had watched him beg, then ordered his men to move out, leaving the elderly couple standing in the ashes of their last shelter as October rain began to fall. Robert Hayes, telling this to Bill's assembled guerrillas, spat into the fire. The old man died 3 days later. Fever took him, Ellen's still alive, staying with kinfolk in Howard County, but she ain't right in the head anymore. She just sits and rocks and cries. Bill's band grew quieter with each report. These weren't soldiers dying, weren't armed men engaged in warfare. These were defenseless people, widows, elderly couples, women alone, being systematically terrorized by a Union general who believed federal authority gave him the right to inflict any cruelty he deemed necessary. Frank James spread a map across a flat rock, marking locations where Ewing had been spotted. "He's following the border of the depopulated zone," Frank said, tracing the route with his finger. "Showing off his work, making sure folks know what defiance costs. Next stop, according to our intelligence, is the Harrison Farm ruins. He wants to give a speech there, tell his men what a success Order Number 11 has been." "How many soldiers?" Bill asked. "Company strength. About 120 men, maybe more, well-armed, disciplined. Ewing ain't stupid. He knows there's guerrillas in Missouri. He's just arrogant enough to think his numbers make him safe." Jesse James, sitting near the fire, looked troubled. "Bill, that's near about twice our numbers. Even if we get every available man, we'd still be outnumbered." "Numbers don't mean much when you pick the ground and hit fast," Archie Clement said. "We've fought worse odds." "Not against regular army in open country," Jesse countered. "Against supply wagons and small patrols, sure. But a full company with a general commanding? That's different." Bill looked at Jesse, and his voice when he spoke was patient but firm. "You're right, it is different. It's different because this time we ain't hitting them for supplies or to disrupt their operations. We're hitting them because their commander is a monster who burns families alive and whips widows for sport." "We're hitting them because if we don't, Ewing will keep doing what he's doing, and more Rebecca Turners and Martin Sykeses will die in misery while he congratulates himself on winning the war." He turned to address the whole camp. "I ain't ordering any man to ride with me on this. It's dangerous as hell and the retaliation will be fierce, but I'm going after Ewing. I'm going to make him answer for every burned farm, every murdered family, every widow he's terrorized. And when I'm done with him, he's going to beg. He's going to beg like Martin Sykes begged, and I'm going to give him the same mercy he showed that old man." Silence fell over the camp. Then Dave Poole stood up, checking his revolvers. "I'm in." "Me too," said Jim Anderson. One by one, every guerrilla volunteered again, their commitment even stronger now that they understood the full scope of Ewing's cruelty. These weren't just soldiers following orders. Ewing was personally directing the terror, personally witnessing the suffering, personally ensuring that Missouri learned its lesson about defying federal authority. Bill looked at his men, his brothers in everything but blood, bound together by loss and rage and the brutal education of border warfare. "Then we start preparing. Frank, I want every detail of Ewing's route. Archie, start scouting the Harrison Farm area. Find us good ambush positions. Cole, reach out to every guerrilla band within riding distance. We're going to need every gun we can get." "What about after?" Frank asked. "After we kill a general, the Union's going to come down on Missouri like the wrath of God." "They're already coming down on Missouri," Bill said. "Order Number 11 already brought the wrath of God. All we're doing is sending it back where it came from." He picked up his revolver, checked the loads. "Besides, I don't plan on there being much of an after for me. I'm going to kill Ewing, and if I die doing it, at least I'll die knowing I made that bastard pay." The camp stirred with grim purpose. Men cleaned weapons, checked ammunition, prepared for what they all knew would be the most dangerous operation they'd ever attempted. In the firelight, their faces showed the marks of 2 years of constant warfare, hard, weathered, aged beyond their years. But underneath the hardness there was something else. There was a sense of righteous purpose, a feeling that what they were about to do transcended ordinary warfare and touched something deeper, something that had to do with basic human dignity and the limits of what civilized men could tolerate before they became uncivilized in response. Bill Anderson sat alone at the edge of camp as his men prepared, looking out into the October darkness. Somewhere out there, General Thomas Ewing Jr. was sleeping comfortable in his tent, confident in his authority and his righteousness, secure in the belief that federal military power made him untouchable. The general had no idea that death was riding toward him through the Missouri brush, carried by men who'd lost everything, and therefore had nothing left to lose. Bill thought about his sisters, crushed in that Kansas City prison. Thought about Thomas Harrison and his family, burned alive in their home. Thought about Rebecca Turner tied to a wagon wheel, and Martin Sykes begging in the rain, and Ellen Sykes rocking and crying in her madness. He thought about all the nameless, faceless Missouri families who'd suffered under Ewing's orders, all the quiet victims of a war that seemed to have forgotten the difference between soldiers and civilians, between warfare and murder. "I'm coming for you, General," Bill whispered to the darkness. "And when I find you, you're going to learn what justice feels like to the families you destroyed. You're going to learn what it feels like to be helpless and terrified, and at the mercy of someone who has no mercy left to give." The wind carried his words away into the Missouri night, where they mixed with the smell of old smoke from burned farms and the ghosts of all the innocent dead. Frank James spread the map across a flat boulder in the center of camp, weighing down the corners with rocks, while Bill and the other guerrilla leaders gathered around. The map showed Jackson County in detail: roads, creeks, farmsteads, everything Frank had marked over 2 years of guerrilla operations. Now he added new information in charcoal, marking Ewing's confirmed route. "Intelligence says Ewing leaves Kansas City on October 23rd, Frank said, tapping the map. "They'll have a full company, around 120 men, possibly more. They'll travel the main road through Independence, then south toward the Harrison farm. That's where he plans to make his speech, stand over the ruins and declare Order Number 11 a success." Bill studied the route, his eyes tracing the roads and terrain. "Where's the bottleneck?" Frank's finger moved to a spot on the map marked Blackwater Valley. "Right here." The road narrows through this valley, steep sides on both ends, creek running alongside. It's about 2 miles from the Harrison farm. If Ewing follows his schedule, he'll pass through around mid-morning on October 24th. "What about approaches?" Cole Younger asked, leaning in to examine the terrain. 3 good positions," Frank said, marking them on the map: North Ridge, South Ridge, and the creek bend at the eastern end. "We put shooters on both ridges, block the eastern exit, and we've got them in a killing box. The column will stretch out in the narrow passage. They won't be able to form proper lines or bring their numbers to bear." Archie Clement nodded slowly. "It could work, but we need to cut off their rear first, stop them from retreating back toward Independence, and we need to isolate Ewing himself. If he gets killed in the initial volley, we lose the whole point of this." "I've been thinking about that," Frank said. He pulled out a piece of paper with sketches on it. "Ewing will ride near the front of the column, surrounded by his personal guard. We need a 2-stage attack. First, we hit the rear hard and fast, create chaos, and cut off their retreat. While they're turning to face that threat, we strike the front and sides. In the confusion, we isolate Ewing's guard and take him alive." Bill listened without speaking, visualizing the ambush in his mind. It was bold, maybe too bold. They'd be attacking a force twice their size in daylight, and one mistake would get them all killed. But it was also exactly the kind of audacious operation that could work, if they executed it perfectly. "How many men do we have?" Bill asked. Jim Anderson consulted a tally he'd been keeping. 78 confirmed. Another dozen maybes if Cole can get word to the bands operating south of here. "I can get word," Cole said. "Question is whether they'll come. Attacking a general is different than our usual work. Some boys might figure it's too hot. Then we work with what we have," Bill said. He turned to Archie. You said you wanted the most dangerous position. You got it. Take 15 men and hit the rear guard. Hit them like hell itself opened up, scatter them, make them think they're facing 100 guerrillas instead of 15. Can you do that? Archie Clement's face split in a fierce grin. Can I do it? Bill, I'll make them think they're facing the whole Confederate army. Dave, you take the North Ridge with 20 men. Frank, you take the South Ridge with 20. I'll have 20 with me at the creek bend. We'll be the ones who move on Ewing once the trap is sprung. Bill looked around at his lieutenants. Questions? Timing, Frank said. If Archie hits too early, they'll form up and be ready for us. Too late, and they'll be through the valley before we can close the trap. I'll have scouts watching, Archie said. When the rear guard enters the valley, that's when I hit. Should give you about 2 minutes before they know what's happening. Bill nodded. 2 minutes is enough. Dave, Frank, you don't fire until you hear Archie's first volley. Then you pour everything into them. Don't give them time to think, time to organize. Just kill and keep killing until I give the signal. What's the signal? Dave Poole asked in his quiet voice. 3 shots from my revolver, spaced 1 second apart. When you hear that, cease fire and wait for orders. That means we've got Ewing. The planning continued for hours. They discussed ammunition. Each man would carry at least 4 revolvers and as much powder and shot as they could manage. They discussed horses, fast mounts for the initial strike, then they'd fight dismounted from cover. They discussed contingencies. What if Ewing had outriders ahead of the column? What if he changed his route? What if reinforcements arrived? For every question, Frank or Bill had an answer. This was what they'd learned over 2 years of guerrilla warfare. How to plan meticulously while staying flexible. How to hit hard and fade fast. How to turn terrain and surprise into weapons that could overcome superior numbers. As the sun set on October 21st, Cole Younger rode out to contact the other guerrilla bands. Bill sent scouts to watch the roads from Kansas City to confirm Ewing's departure and track his progress. Archie took a small group to scout Blackwater Valley in detail, marking exact positions and distances, finding covered approaches and escape routes. The camp transformed from a resting place into a military operation. Men cleaned weapons obsessively, checking each revolver's action, ensuring every percussion cap was seated properly, every load was fresh. They sharpened knives, checked saddle girths, prepared everything they'd need for the hardest fight of their lives. Jesse James worked alongside his brother Frank, preparing ammunition and organizing supplies. Bill noticed the young man's hands shaking slightly as he loaded powder into a flask. "You scared?" Bill asked, sitting down beside Jesse. Jesse looked up, startled, then nodded slowly. "Yes, sir. Reckon I'd be a fool not to be." "Fear's natural," Bill said. "Fear keeps you alive if you let it sharpen your senses instead of freezing you up. The trick is to focus it, use it." "How do you do it?" Jesse asked. "Stay calm when the bullets start flying?" Bill was quiet for a moment, looking at the young guerrilla who'd someday become more famous than Bill himself, though neither of them knew it yet. "I think about why I'm fighting," Bill said finally. "I think about my sisters, about all the families Ewing destroyed. I think about justice. And I remember that dying ain't the worst thing that can happen to a man. Living without dignity, living under the boot of tyrants who murder women and burn families, that's worse than dying." Jesse absorbed this, then went back to his work with steadier hands. On October 22nd, Cole Younger returned with good news. He'd contacted 3 other guerrilla bands, and they'd agreed to join the attack. 17 more men, bringing the total force to 95. Still outnumbered, but better odds than before. That night, Bill gathered everyone around a large fire and laid out the plan one final time. He spoke clearly and simply, making sure every man understood his role, his position, his objectives. Then he addressed the larger purpose. "Tomorrow night, we ride for Blackwater Valley," Bill said. Day after that, we killed General Thomas Ewing, Jr. Now, I want every man here to understand what that means. The Union will come after us harder than they ever have before. They'll hunt us without mercy. Some of us won't survive the winter." He paused, looking at the faces around the fire. Hard faces, young faces, faces marked by violence and loss, but faces that still held determination and purpose. "But I also want you to understand why we're doing this. Ewing ain't just another Union officer. He's the man who ordered the deportation of 10,000 Missouri civilians. He's the man who burns families alive in their homes. He's the man who whips widows and terrorizes old folks for the crime of wanting to stay on their own land. He represents everything this war has become: power without mercy, authority without conscience, cruelty dressed up as military necessity." Bill's voice grew harder, colder. "When we kill Ewing, we're sending a message that echoes beyond Missouri, beyond this war. We're saying that rank don't protect you from justice. We're saying that federal authority don't give you the right to murder innocents. We're saying that for every family you burn, for every woman you terrorize, for every old man you leave to die in the rain, someone will come for you. Someone will make you pay." The guerrillas listened in absolute silence, and Bill saw in their eyes the same hard purpose he felt in his own heart. "So yes," Bill continued, "the Union will hunt us, and yes, some of us will die. But we'll die knowing we made a general beg. We'll die knowing we brought justice to a man who thought himself above justice, and maybe, just maybe, the next Union officer who thinks about burning families or whipping widows will remember what happened to General Ewing, and he'll think twice." Archie Clement stood up. "I'll follow you into hell, Bill, and I'll laugh the whole way." "To bloody Bill!" someone shouted, and the cry was taken up around the fire. "To bloody Bill!" Bill let them have their moment, let them build their courage with words and camaraderie. But inside he felt only cold purpose. This wasn't about glory or reputation. This was about making evil men suffer the consequences of their evil. This was about the Harrisons burning in their home, about Rebecca Turner tied to a wagon wheel, about Martin Sykes dying in the rain. This was about his sisters, crushed in a Kansas City prison while Ewing called it an unfortunate accident. On October 23rd, scouts reported that Ewing had left Kansas City on schedule, riding at the head of a column of federal soldiers. The general looked confident, according to the reports, sitting tall in his saddle, already rehearsing the speech he'd give at the Harrison Farm ruins. Bill's band mounted up in the late afternoon, riding out in small groups to avoid attention. They took separate routes to Blackwater Valley, planning to converge at their assigned positions after dark. The October air was cold, smelling of coming winter and distant wood smoke. The sky overhead was gray and heavy, threatening rain. As Bill rode, he thought about tomorrow, thought about the ambush, about the moment when Ewing would realize he'd ridden into a trap, thought about looking the general in the eye and making him understand, really understand, what he'd done. Thought about justice, cold, hard, inevitable justice, finally catching up to a man who'd believed himself beyond its reach. They reached Blackwater Valley after midnight. The guerrillas moved into position silently, each group finding the spots Frank had marked on the map. Bill positioned his men at the creek bend, where they'd wait until the trap was sprung. From here, he could see the valley stretched out below, the road winding through it like a pale ribbon in the moonlight. Somewhere to the south, General Ewing slept in his tent, confident and safe, surrounded by 120 federal soldiers. He had no idea that death was waiting for him in a Missouri valley, carried by 95 guerrillas who'd lost everything except their capacity for vengeance. Bill Anderson checked his revolvers one last time, then settled in to wait for dawn. Tomorrow, he thought. Tomorrow a general learns to beg. October 24th, 1864. Dawn came cold and gray over Blackwater Valley, mist rising from the creek and hanging in the hollow like gun smoke. Bill Anderson lay behind a fallen cottonwood log, watching the eastern approach where Ewing's column would appear. Around him, 20 guerrillas waited in absolute silence, their breath steaming in the cold air, their hands steady on their weapons. At 7:30 in the morning, the scouts signaled. The column was coming. Bill watched through a gap in the logs as the first Union soldiers appeared, riding two abreast down the narrow road. Outriders first, then the main body of troops, then there. General Thomas Ewing, Jr., riding a fine bay horse surrounded by a protective square of mounted officers. The general sat straight and confident, occasionally turning to speak to the men around him, his face showing no concern at all. The column stretched out as it entered the valley, just as Frank had predicted. 130 soldiers, Bill counted, slightly more than intelligence had suggested. The odds had just gotten worse. But odds didn't matter anymore. Nothing mattered except making Ewing pay. The rear guard entered the valley. Bill waited, counting seconds, waited for Archie's signal, waited while his heart hammered and his hands stayed steady and every nerve in his body screamed for action. Then, from the valley's northern end, gunfire erupted like the world splitting open. Archie Clement's 15 guerrillas hit the rear guard with devastating fury, revolvers blazing, men screaming rebel yells that echoed off the valley walls. Federal soldiers tumbled from their horses, confusion spreading like wildfire through the ranks. The rear guard tried to wheel and form up, but Archie's men were already moving, shooting, reloading, shooting again with practiced efficiency. 2 seconds later, Dave Poole's men opened fire from the north ridge. Then Frank's men from the south ridge. The valley became a killing box, crossfire cutting through the Federal column like a scythe through wheat. Horses screamed and reared. Men died before they could draw weapons. Officers shouted orders that were lost in the chaos of gunfire and screaming. Bill waited 3 more seconds, watching Ewing's guard try to form a protective circle around the general. Then he gave the signal. His 20 men rose from cover and charged, hitting the column's front like a hammer. Bill fired his first revolver empty in seconds, dropped it, drew a second, kept firing. A Federal officer went down with a bullet in his throat. Another took 2 rounds to the chest and fell sideways from his saddle. The Federal troops trained for conventional warfare couldn't adapt fast enough to guerrilla tactics. They tried to form lines, tried to return organized fire, but the guerrillas were already among them, fighting at close range where discipline meant nothing and killing efficiency meant everything. Bill fought his way toward Ewing with single-minded purpose. He saw Jim Anderson take down 2 soldiers with 4 shots, saw Cole Younger wrestling a Federal lieutenant off his horse, saw Jesse James, face pale but determined, firing with both hands. Then he saw Dave Poole go down, shot through the chest by a Federal sergeant. Dave's body hit the ground and didn't move. The sergeant turned, looking for another target, and Bill put 2 bullets in his head. No time to grieve. No time for anything except reaching Ewing. The general's guard was professional and brave. They'd closed ranks around Ewing, firing in controlled volleys, using their horses as barricades. Bill's advance stalled as Federal bullets whined past his head. He dove behind a dead horse, reloading, calculating angles. Frank James appeared beside him, breathing hard. "We need to break that guard." "Get some boys to flank left," Bill said. "I'll take right. On my signal, we rush them together." Frank nodded and scrambled away. Bill counted his remaining revolvers. 3 loaded, 1 empty. Would have to be enough. He looked around for more guerrillas, found Jim Anderson and Archie Clement fighting nearby. "Jim, Archie, with me!" The 3 of them moved right while Frank's group moved left. The Federal Guard was focused on the frontal threat, didn't see the flanking movements until too late. Bill rose from cover and charged, firing as he ran. Archie beside him, laughing like a madman, putting bullets into Federal soldiers with terrible accuracy. Jim Anderson roaring like a bear, his face twisted with rage. The guard collapsed inward. Officers fell. The protective circle broke. And suddenly, there was Ewing trying to control his panicked horse, his face showing fear for the first time. Bill grabbed the general's bridle, yanked hard. The horse reared, and Ewing tumbled backward, hitting the ground hard. Bill was on him in an instant, revolver pressed to the general's forehead. "Move and you die," Bill said quietly. Ewing froze. Around them, the battle still raged, but Bill's objective was accomplished. He had the general. "Frank," Bill shouted. "Signal ceasefire!" 3 spaced shots rang out, the signal they'd agreed on. The guerrilla firing slackened, then stopped. The federal troops, leaderless and scattered, began to retreat toward independence, leaving their dead and wounded behind. Bill let them go. He'd gotten what he came for. The valley fell silent except for the moans of wounded men and the nervous stamping of riderless horses. Bill hauled Ewing to his feet, keeping the revolver pressed against his spine. General Thomas Ewing Jr. stood 5 feet 10 inches tall, 44 years old, dressed in a Union general's uniform that was now covered in dust and dirt. His face was pale, his eyes wide with shock, and the first edges of real terror. "You're Anderson," Ewing said, his voice shaking despite his attempt at composure. "Bloody Bill Anderson." "That's right," Bill said, "and you're the son of a bitch who burns families alive." Ewing's military training tried to assert itself. "I'm a general in the United States Army. If you kill me, the retaliation will—" Bill hit him. Not with the gun, just his fist. A short, brutal punch to the stomach that doubled Ewing over, gasping. When the general straightened, blood ran from his split lip. "You don't give orders here," Bill said. "You don't negotiate. You don't talk unless I tell you to talk. You understand?" Ewing nodded, the reality of his situation finally penetrating his officer's arrogance. Bill's guerrillas gathered around, forming a circle. They'd lost 6 men in the ambush, Dave Poole, 2 of Cole's recruits, and 3 from the other bands, another dozen wounded. But they'd routed a federal column and captured a general. The cost was high, but they'd achieved something unprecedented in the border war. "Tie him," Bill said, and Jim Anderson bound Ewing's hands behind his back with rough rope, pulling it tight enough to make the general wince. Bill walked to his saddlebag and pulled out 2 items he'd been carrying since the Harrison farm burning. The first was a charred child's doll, recovered from the ruins. The second was a scrap of cloth, blood-stained and torn, a piece of his sister Josephine's dress, saved from the Kansas City prison collapse. He walked back to Ewing and held up the doll. "You know what this is?" Ewing stared at it, recognition dawning in his eyes. "This belonged to Elizabeth Harrison's daughter," Bill said. "You remember the Harrisons? The family you burned alive in their home because they refused to abandon their land?" That was military necessity," Ewing stammered. "They defied federal orders." Bill hit him again, harder this time. Ewing went down on his knees, blood pouring from his nose. "That's for Elizabeth Harrison," Bill said. He held up the piece of cloth. "This was my sister's dress. Josephine Anderson. She died when the Kansas City prison collapsed, the prison where you kept Confederate women as hostages. You remember that? You remember calling it an unfortunate accident?" Ewing said nothing, his eyes fixed on the ground. "Look at me," Bill said softly. Ewing looked up, and Bill saw the moment the general truly understood his situation. Saw the moment Ewing realized he wasn't going to talk his way out, wasn't going to be ransomed or exchanged, wasn't going to survive this encounter. "You like making examples of people," Bill said. "You like teaching lessons. Well, General, today you're going to learn a lesson yourself." Bill turned to his men. "Mount up. We're taking him to the Harrison farm." They rode south through the October morning, Ewing on foot with a rope around his neck, forced to walk behind Bill's horse like a dog on a leash. The 2-mile journey took over an hour, Ewing stumbling and falling, getting dragged when he couldn't keep up, his fine uniform getting torn and filthy. Word of the ambush had spread fast. By the time they reached the Harrison farm ruins, a crowd had gathered, displaced Missouri families, Confederate sympathizers, people who'd lost everything to Order Number 11. They stood silent as Bill's band arrived, their faces hard and unforgiving. Bill dismounted and dragged Ewing to the center of the burned foundation, where blackened timbers and scorched stone marked where the Harrison house had stood, where a family had died screaming. "You were going to give a speech here," Bill said to Ewing, "about how successful Order Number 11 was, about how you taught Missouri a lesson. Well, General, you're still going to give that speech, but first, you're going to do something else." Bill forced Ewing to his knees. The general's face was bleeding, his nose broken, his uniform torn. All his authority, all his dignity, all his confidence had been stripped away. He was just a man now, a terrified man facing death. "You're going to read names," Bill said. He pulled out a list compiled over weeks from his informants. Names of families burned out under Order Number 11, names of people who died during the deportations, names of women terrorized and old folks left to die. "Read," Bill commanded. Ewing's hands shook as he took the paper. His voice cracked as he began reading the names. Thomas and Margaret Harrison, Elizabeth Harrison, Martin and Ellen Sykes, Rebecca Turner, William and Sarah Mitchell. On and on, over 100 names, each one representing a life destroyed by the general's orders. The crowd listened in silence. Some wept. Some stood with faces like stone. All bore witness as General Thomas Ewing, Jr., on his knees in the ruins of a family he'd murdered, was forced to acknowledge what his orders had done. When the last name was read, Bill took the paper back. "Now beg," he said. "What?" Ewing's voice was barely a whisper. "Beg for your life. Like Martin Sykes begged, like Rebecca Turner begged, like every helpless person you terrorized begged. You wanted to teach lessons. Here's your lesson. Feel what they felt. Beg like they begged, and receive the same mercy you showed them." For a long moment, Ewing tried to hold on to his pride, tried to die like a soldier, with dignity and tact. But fear won. Fear and the realization that he was going to die here, in the ruins he'd created, surrounded by the families he'd destroyed. "Please," Ewing whispered. Then louder, "Please. I was following orders. I was fighting the rebellion. I was just doing my duty." "Louder," Bill said coldly. "Let everyone hear." "Please," Ewing screamed, tears and blood running down his face. "Please don't kill me. I'll leave Missouri. I'll resign my commission. I'll do anything. Please, God, please." He was sobbing now, all pretense of military bearing gone. General Thomas Ewing, Jr., architect of Order Number 11, representative of federal authority, reduced to a weeping, begging wreck in the dirt. Bill let him beg. Let him feel the helplessness and terror. Let him understand finally what he'd done to innocent people. Then Bill raised his revolver. "You showed no mercy to the Harrisons," Bill said. "You showed no mercy to Martin Sykes, to Rebecca Turner, to any of the thousands you terrorized. So I'll show you the same mercy." He paused, letting Ewing hope for one more second. Which is to say, none at all. The shot echoed across the burned farm. General Thomas Ewing, Jr. slumped forward, dead before he hit the ground. Bill took the general's copy of Order Number 11 from his uniform pocket and pinned it to the body with a knife. The crowd stood silent for a long moment. Then, slowly, they began to disperse, walking away without speaking. Justice had been done. Brutal, harsh, final justice, but it didn't bring back the dead, didn't rebuild the burned homes, didn't heal Missouri. Bill Anderson stood over Ewing's body, feeling nothing. No satisfaction, no peace, no sense of completion. Just emptiness and the knowledge that one debt had been paid, even though thousands more could never be collected. He turned to his men. "Mount up, we're done here." As they rode away, Bill looked back once at the Harrison farm ruins, at Ewing's body lying where a family had burned, at the charred timbers and scorched earth that represented everything wrong with this war. He thought about Dave Poole, dead in Blackwater Valley, thought about his sisters, crushed in Kansas City, thought about all the blood that had been spilled, all the vengeance that had been taken, all the justice that had been delivered at gunpoint, and he thought, This is what we've become. This is what the border war has made us. Killers of generals, dealers of harsh justice, men who make other men beg before we execute them. But someone had to do it. Someone had to make the powerful pay for their crimes. Someone had to show that rank and authority didn't place you above justice. Even if that someone was bloody Bill Anderson, guerrilla and killer, riding through Missouri with blood on his hands and emptiness in his soul. News of General Ewing's death spread across Missouri like wildfire through dry grass. Within 24 hours, every county knew. Within 48 hours, word had reached Union headquarters in St. Louis. Within a week, newspapers in Washington were printing stories about the Union general executed by bushwhackers in the ruins of a family he'd burned alive. The federal response was swift and brutal. General Clinton Furbish, Ewing's replacement, declared martial law across the entire Missouri-Kansas border. He tripled the number of troops hunting guerrilla bands. He authorized summary executions for anyone suspected of aiding bushwhackers. He promised $10,000 in gold for information leading to Bill Anderson's capture. Dead or alive, preferably dead. But the Union's fury couldn't touch the fact that Bill Anderson had done something no other guerrilla had managed. He'd made a general beg, then executed him in the ruins of his own crimes. The symbolism was too powerful to erase with soldiers and proclamations. Bill's band scattered after the Harrison farm, splitting into small groups to avoid the federal dragnet. They'd agreed to meet again in 2 weeks, at a predetermined location in Lafayette County. Bill rode with just Archie Clement, Jim Anderson, and Frank James, moving through the Missouri brush like ghosts, avoiding roads and settlements. They stopped one night at a creek to water their horses and rest. Frank built a small fire, carefully shielded so the light wouldn't show. The 4 men sat in silence, each lost in his own thoughts. "Dave's dead," Archie said finally, breaking the quiet. "And for what? Ewing's dead too, but Missouri's still burning. The war's still going, nothing's changed." "Something changed," Frank said quietly. "Federal officers across Missouri are looking over their shoulders now. They're wondering if they're next. They're thinking twice before they burn the next farm or terrorize the next widow. That's what changed." Bill stared into the fire, saying nothing. He'd barely spoken since leaving the Harrison farm, his silence deep and heavy. "Are you all right, Bill?" Jim Anderson asked his brother. Bill looked up, his eyes reflecting firelight. "I made him beg, made him feel what all his victims felt, made him read their names and acknowledge what he'd done. Then I killed him." He paused. "And I don't feel any different. My sisters are still dead. The Harrisons are still dead. Dave Poole is still dead. Ewing's death didn't bring any of them back." "Wasn't supposed to bring them back," Archie said. "Was supposed to be justice." "Was it?" Bill asked. "Or was it just revenge dressed up in fancy words?" Frank James, always the thoughtful one, considered the question. "Maybe there ain't much difference between justice and revenge when you're the one pulling the trigger. But I'll tell you what I know. Ewing burned families alive. He whipped widows. He terrorized old folks. He did all that wearing a general's uniform and claiming federal authority. And for 2 years he got away with it because nobody could touch him." Frank met Bill's eyes. "Until you did. Until you made him answer for every crime, every cruelty, every family he destroyed. That matters, Bill. It matters that evil men can't hide behind rank and authority forever." "Frank's right," Jim Anderson said. "You showed Missouri, hell, you showed the whole country, that nobody's above justice, not generals, not politicians, not anyone. You made Ewing pay the same price he made innocent folks pay. If that ain't justice, I don't know what is." Bill nodded slowly, but his expression didn't change. The emptiness that had settled over him after Ewing's execution remained, deep and cold as a Missouri winter. They reached the rendezvous point in Lafayette County 12 days later. Cole Younger was already there with 15 men. Jesse James arrived the next day with another 8. By the end of the week, nearly 60 guerrillas had assembled. survivors of the Blackwater Valley ambush, and new recruits drawn by the story of what Bill had done. The new men looked at Bill Anderson with something approaching awe. He'd become a legend, the guerrilla who'd captured and executed a Union general. Songs were already being written about the ambush, about Ewing begging in the ruins, about Bloody Bill's cold justice. But Bill himself seemed diminished somehow, hollowed out by the very act that had made him legendary. He gave orders mechanically, planned operations without his usual fierce intensity, rode at the head of his band like a man going through motions he no longer believed in. It was Cole Younger who finally confronted him, pulling Bill aside one evening while the rest of the band prepared for a raid on a federal supply depot. "What's eating you, Bill? You accomplished what no other guerrilla has done. You're a hero to every Confederate family in Missouri. Why do you look like a man who's already dead?" Bill was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was low and tired. "You know what Ewing said when I made him read those names? When he was on his knees begging. He said he was just following orders, said he was doing his duty. And the hell of it is, Cole, he probably believed that. He probably thought burning families and terrorizing widows was righteous work, because it served the Union cause." "So," Cole said, "that don't excuse what he did." "No, it don't," Bill agreed. "But it made me think, what do I believe? I've killed so many men I've lost count. I've burned, terrorized, executed. I tell myself it's justice, it's vengeance for my sisters and all the innocent folks the Union has murdered. But how am I different from Ewing? We both kill in the name of a cause we think is righteous." Cole Younger looked at his friend, seeing the doubt and exhaustion that had crept into Bill's soul. "You're different because you fight for folks who can't fight for themselves. You're different because you don't hide behind authority or claim you're just following orders. You own what you do, Bill. You make evil men pay for evil acts. That's the difference." "Is it enough?" Bill asked. "Is it enough to own your violence, to acknowledge what you've become, or does it just make me an honest killer instead of a dishonest one?" Cole didn't have an answer for that. 3 weeks after Ewing's execution, Bill led his band in a raid on a federal cavalry patrol near Rocheport. It was a small engagement, barely worth noting in the larger context of the war. But it was significant for one reason: Rebecca Turner was there. She'd been living rough in the woods, still not right in her head after Ewing had her whipped in Lone Jack. When she heard that Bill Anderson's band was nearby, she'd walked 5 miles to find them. Now she stood in the guerrilla camp, her back still scarred from the whipping, her eyes still holding that broken, distant look. But when she saw Bill, something focused in her expression. She walked up to him, and for a moment just looked at him. Then she spoke, her voice hoarse from disuse. "They told me you killed him. Killed the general who had me whipped. Is it true?" Bill nodded. "Yes, Ma'am, it's true." Rebecca Turner's face crumpled, not with grief, but with something like relief, like a burden had been lifted that she'd been carrying too long. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for making him pay." She walked away then, back toward whatever rough shelter she'd found in the woods. But Bill stood frozen, watching her go, and for the first time since Ewing's execution, he felt something other than emptiness. Not satisfaction exactly, not peace, but a sense that what he'd done had mattered to someone, had given some small measure of comfort to one of Ewing's victims. Maybe that was enough. Maybe that was all justice could ever be: small comforts given to broken people, small retributions taken against men who thought themselves untouchable. Maybe expecting more than that was asking too much from a world as brutal as the Missouri border. The war ground on. Bill Anderson continued fighting, continued leading his guerrillas in raids and ambushes, continued building his reputation as the most feared bushwhacker on the frontier. But something had changed in him after Ewing. He was colder, harder, more reckless. Men who rode with him noticed he seemed to be courting death, taking unnecessary risks, fighting with the fury of a man who no longer cared whether he survived. On October 27, 1864, just 1 month and 3 days after he executed General Ewing, Bill Anderson rode into the town of Centralia with 80 guerrillas. What happened there would become his most infamous act, the massacre that would cement his reputation as Bloody Bill, the bushwhacker too brutal even for the brutal border war. But that's another story. 6 weeks after Centralia, on October 26, 1864, Bill Anderson was killed in an ambush near Albany, Missouri. He was 24 years old. Federal troops found his body and displayed it publicly, proof that even Bloody Bill could be killed. They counted the scalps on his saddle, 53 of them, each representing a Union soldier Bill had killed in his short, violent life. Jesse James, who'd ridden with Bill at Blackwater Valley and watched him make a general beg, would go on to become an outlaw legend himself. Years later, during his own criminal career, Jesse would tell the story of the day Bill Anderson captured General Ewing. He'd describe Bill's cold fury, Ewing's terrified begging, the execution in the ruins of the Harrison farm. And Jesse would say, "That was the day I learned that justice and vengeance ain't so different when you're looking down the barrel of a gun." Frank James, the thoughtful brother, would write in his memoirs, "Bill Anderson was a hard man who did hard things. History will judge him harshly, and maybe that judgment is fair. But I was there when he made General Ewing answer for burning families alive. I was there when he forced that general to read the names of his victims and feel their terror. And I can't say Bill was wrong for doing it." The Missouri-Kansas border would remember Bill Anderson for generations, not as hero, not as villain, but as something more complicated and more true. He was the inevitable consequence of a war that had forgotten the difference between soldiers and civilians, between warfare and murder. He was what happened when you pushed men past the point where they valued their own lives more than vengeance. General Thomas Ewing Jr.'s death changed Union policy in Missouri. Federal officers became more cautious, less likely to personally oversee acts of terror against civilians. Order Number 11 remained in effect, but its enforcement became less brutal, more focused on actual military threats than on terrorizing entire populations. It wasn't much. It didn't bring back the dead or rebuild the burned farms, but it was something. A small check on federal power, a small reminder that actions had consequences even for generals. And in the end, maybe that was the real lesson of Bill Anderson's war. Not that violence solved problems, or that vengeance brought peace, but that in a world gone mad with cruelty and killing, someone had to stand up and say enough. Someone had to make the powerful pay. Someone had to show that no rank, no authority, no claim of military necessity could protect you forever from the consequences of evil acts. Bill Anderson was that someone, And whether history remembers him as hero or monster, one fact remains undeniable. When General Thomas Ewing Jr. died on his knees in the ruins of the Harrison farm, begging for a mercy he'd never shown to others, justice was done. Harsh justice. Brutal justice. Missouri border justice. But justice nonetheless. Well, there you have it, folks. Subscribe if you haven't already. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from and what do you think about what Anderson did? Let's hear it.